Well, hey guys, welcome back. I hope you had a good semester. It's time for test three. So in this video, we're going to review the main concepts you need to know to prepare and kind of talk through how the test will be structured. So like the other tests, this will be a short answer based test where you're going to be given a scenario and you'll work through the things that you've learned in sort of an application, explaining your logic, showing your thought process. So in the first scenario, I'm going to give you a scenario kind of describing um, a situation where the conditions for two species to diverge and evolve might be met, and so you're going to think through that scenario um, and answer some questions about it. So the first thing you'll be asked to do is to define biological evolution through this particular example, and kind of just give a textbook definition for what evolution is. Second, you'll be asked to explain how natural selection works and what conditions are required for a new species to emerge over time. And then in that particular scenario, you'll be given a couple questions where you'll think about how the selective pressures might cause those populations to diverge and evolve differently over time. So kind of applying it in that scenario. The second scenario, you're going to be given sort of scenario where an ecosystem is at threat. There are changes in the habitat that are creating loss in biodiversity. And so you're going to think through that particular scenario and answer questions. First, you're going to be asked to define biodiversity and explain why it's important. Second, you're going to be asked to define the term environmental stewardship, particularly from a biblical worldview perspective. And then in that particular scenario, you're going to be asked to identify the key ways that human activity is threatening biodiversity and come up with some ways to monitor that biodiversity, and then also strategies for conserving biodiversity, mitigating the impacts of those activities you identify. So let's look at definitions first. It's important to define terms really in any debate, any conversation. Hopefully the reading has been helpful here, but some terms that might come to mind before you engaged in learning this semester might be microevolution, right? So sometimes when we think about evolution, a term we might be used as microevolution. What does that mean? What's the context for that? Typically that's used to describe kind of small progressive changes, but still within the confines of a species. Another definition might be speciation. Maybe evolution is defined as when a new species emerges or originates. But there are questions there, right? How do we define a species? What is a species? Third, and a more expansive definition of evolution might encompass universal common descent. So extrapolating those ideas to sort of indefinite time and incorporating a worldview that all life descended from a common ancestor, right? So that might be incorporated in a Christian worldview. It might be incorporated in a naturalistic worldview, but that's another term we might use to define evolution. And then kind of within that, the mechanisms being random mutation and natural selection, particularly in a naturalistic worldview. So here's the definition that I think your textbook offers. It's really helpful. So the simple kind of 30,000 foot view definition for evolution would be the gradual change in characteristics of a population over time, right? So this really encompasses the heart of evolution, but in a broad way, kind of divorced from worldview implications or extrapolations. So in this simple definition, biological evolution occurs when there's a gradual change in the characteristics of the phenotype, and you know by now that the phenotype or the physical traits are a direct result of the changes in the genes that encode for those traits. But those change in a population of organisms over time, right? So individuals don't evolve, populations do, and it takes time, right? There have to be selective pressures that push on it. There have to be existing genetic differences that can be capitalized on, or a mutation that occurs that can be capitalized on by natural selection for the survival of a particular subset of that population. So there's your definition: gradual change in characteristics of a population over time. There's some limitations to thinking about the extent of evolution. That's kind of beyond the scope of this particular test question, but just wanted to throw that out there for you. You've talked about it in your writing, but part of thinking about the extent of evolution is defining a species, right? So your textbook definition is a group of organisms that can breed and make fertile offspring, right? So they can reproduce and make fertile offspring. So, an example where species might be different would be in the equine family. A horse and a donkey are similar, they're closely related, and they can actually breed, but when they produce offspring, they produce donkeys or hennies, depending on the paternal and maternal line there. And so, even though they're really closely related, enough so that they can breed, they produce infertile offspring. And so we would kind of draw the line there and say these are different species. Sometimes that definition works, but sometimes it's more difficult. We'll talk about that in a minute. So some things that are required for a new species to emerge, we'll elaborate on this in a second, but we need reproductive isolation, and we need evolutionary independence. In other words, they are isolated reproductively, and there is some kind of independent mechanism driving the evolution. An interesting idea is, when the scriptures talk about the kinds, particularly in Noah's flood, when God is executing his wrath on creation, and he's choosing to save a remnant for himself, which is really the seed of the gospel narrative throughout the Bible. But he chooses Noah and his family to start over. But he commands Noah and his family to build the ark and then go and get 2 of every kinds. What do you mean by kinds? Are those species? Are they genus level? Are they some other higher taxonomic level? Food for thought, right? But probably something higher than species. So what's required for a new species to form? We'll come back to limitations. There are some criteria that need to be met, hypothetically, for the conditions to be right for natural selection to drive the formation of a new species. Number 1, isolation, meaning genetically, geographically, ecologically, maybe a combination of those, but they are subsets of this particular population, right? Subgroups of this particular population of organisms that are the same species become isolated to the point where they are not able to interbreed and create genetic diversity, right? So we create this fork in the road. In this particular graphic here, this population of lizards is isolated, right? They are carried over to a remote island and separated in that way. Second, mutation has to happen. We could say genetic diversity. So there has to be some kind of divergence in a particular trait, or a diversity in a trait within those 2 groups. And then third, natural selection has to happen. So this particular mutation or particular divergent trait has to give some kind of adaptive advantage, some kind of survivorship advantage. And so if those conditions are met, isolation, genetic diversity from a mutation, and then natural selection that drives kind of the favoring of that particular trait, then the conditions might be met for, over time, a new population to emerge. So you can see in this example, we get isolation in step 1. In step 2, we've got divergence in the genetic population, right? There was some kind of a mutation that emerged in certain individuals in this isolated population, and then the idea here would be there was some kind of natural selection, right, that drove the preference, the shift in population to be more red. So over time we end up with these red colored lizards and these green colored lizards, and at some point they may even be different species. So again, that's just an example. It's important to think through how that might work. So limitations, there are lots of limitations to evolution, and we'll talk about those really beyond the scope of this test. So you've already dealt with it, thinking about some of the worldview questions you've answered. But from a purely definitional standpoint, we can conceptualize evolution and track species when we have traits, and we can see those traits result in different genetic richness of a particular trait in a population, and then certainly when species emerge. But sometimes it's not so easy to discern when a new species has emerged, right? For example, bacteria or plants that self-fertilize. In this case, we've got asexual reproduction, or we've got self-fertilization. What's our criterion for designing a species, or defining what a species is there? It's a little more difficult. What about extinct species? What about assumptions about the rate of extinction? So again, there are limitations even there at the species level. Um, so another part of this scenario, you're going to have to define biological evolution, think through the conditions that need to be met for evolution to occur. So again, isolation, genetic diversity, and natural selection. But then just be able to define natural selection for me. So describe it for me. How does natural selection work? Um, so again, we've talked about some of the criteria. Individuals, members of a population have to differ. So there has to be some genetic diversity in the population. Second, some of those differences or those differences that can drive natural selection must be inheritable, meaning they must be able to be passed on from parent to offspring, right? They can't just be acquired traits or developed traits. And then third, there has to be some kind of survivorship advantage. Right? So in each generation, some individual in a population survive and reproduce successfully, and others don't. And sort of the fourth element of that, or the piggyback of that, would be that these particular traits that are giving the survivorship advantage are what is causing these particular individuals to survive. So again, natural selection in a nutshell, we've got genetic diversity, we've got a change in the environment. Maybe it's isolation, maybe it's predation comes in, food scarcity, population density. Something happens that puts a pressure on that particular population, and depending on what that pressure is and what that particular trait is, that's the recipe for evolution. So again, natural selection is kind of concisely defined when individuals of a population possess an advantageous trait, a trait that is more favorable given the environmental pressure that is happening, such that those advantageous traits cause those individuals to survive longer, leave more offspring, and so that results in evolution, right? That's kind of the driving force that causes this change in characteristics of a population over time, sometimes to the point of new species emerging. So some examples of natural selection, one would be the Polynesian cricket. So this was an example not too long ago that was mentioned in your textbook where there was an introduction of a parasitic fly in this island, this Polynesian island where these crickets were. And the parasitic fly was able to locate prey and prey on the crickets based on their sound, right? So crickets that had naturally smaller files, right, had naturally smaller ridges in here that created quieter sounds were more likely to survive, right? So the genetic diversity was there. There were already some crickets in the population that had different file sizes and quieter chirps. But because the parasite was able to prey on the more noisy crickets, then over time the population shifted, right? The population of crickets that had the quieter files, the quieter chirping sound because of the files, survived. And so over time, we got a cricket that had no file altogether. They could make essentially no sound or very, very minute sound because of that pressure that was put on by the environment, in this case, the arising of a parasite. Some other examples in agriculture. So this would be more sort of artificial selection in that it's a man-made presence, but glyphosate, aka Roundup, right? So we found that while glyphosate is a widely effective, widely used herbicide, over time it's led to, guess what, Roundup-resistant weed species that, again, had some population of them had a natural resistance to it. And after repeated application of the herbicide, we've selected for, the population has changed, where the ones that survived and then took over the population were the ones that had the genetic variability to withstand Roundup application. We've even seen this happen in the pesticide world, insecticide world. Another would be antibiotics, right? This is a classic one, but antibiotic resistance, because bacteria are prokaryotic and they reproduce quickly through asexual reproduction. We can see evolution happen more quickly in those. So a good example would be antibiotic resistance. So on the left here, we've got these zones of inhibition. These little discs have antibiotics in them. The yellow smears in the background are bacteria that have been plated. And so you can see that these antibiotics that are applied to the dish are creating zones of inhibition, meaning these bacteria are prevented from growing by these antibiotics. Over time, so what you see here on the right is after repeat cycles of applying the bacteria or applying the antibiotic to the bacteria, some of the bacteria or these bacteria had developed resistance to some of these antibiotics, right? So you can see that these four have small zones of inhibition. These have a couple, but these other ones, there's complete resistance, right? That they're not affected by the bacteria in any at all. And again, that happens through natural selection, right? So some of these bacteria had mutations, or a mutation happened that allowed them to resist the bacteria, not be affected by, or resist the antibiotic and not be affected by the antibiotic. And over time, right, through natural selection, those that didn't have the trait died out. Those that had the trait became more prevalent, and so now we've got this new population of bacteria that are antibiotic resistant. Okay, second scenario we're going to have on the test is dealing with biodiversity, environmental stewardship. So I'm going to give you a scenario where you think through how this particular ecosystem is being negatively affected by human activity and changes in the environment, how that's creating loss in biodiversity, how you could measure and monitor the biodiversity, and how you can propose interventions for mitigating those effects and maintaining or even recovering the biodiversity. So one aspect is to define biodiversity. Simply put, biodiversity is the diversity of life on Earth that enables life to persist, right? It's this sustaining force that enables life to be resilient and to keep on keeping on. There are many layers to biodiversity, right? So one is species diversity or species richness. So one aspect of diversity is just the number of different types of organisms that are living in a particular habitat, right? So the greater diversity there, the more species we have cohabitating in the area, we would say that has more biodiversity. And again, that gives it more resilience, more interconnected processes that create stability, right? So if something happens in an environment, it's more likely to recover. Another aspect would be genetic diversity. So within a particular population, we've got a wide range of genetic diversity. We've just talked about how that works from a evolutionary standpoint. So you can imagine if we got a large population and we've got a lot of diversity in that population, if environmental changes happen, which happen over time, right? Natural disasters, changes in climate on a small scale, or even sometimes on a biosphere scale, changes in food source, changes in forest density, you name it, right? Things that happen in the environment, they're going to put pressure on that population. But the greater genetic diversity, the more likely that population is able to persist, right? Some of the population will be negatively affected, but those that have traits that give a survivorship advantage, they're going to survive and persist and eventually recover and keep living. Another aspect would be ecological diversity. So this is a diversity in habitats within an ecosystem, and on a bigger scale, ecosystems in a larger area. So the diversity in habitats and ecosystems creates this gradient of processes that kind of leads to the fourth, which is functional diversity. So there are processes, the carbon cycle, the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, that are driven by the Earth's atmosphere, driven by sunlight, driven by the food web, right? Driven by changes in biome structure in particular ecosystems that are driven by climate. And all of those things are measures of biodiversity. So all those things together create resilience in the system. So biodiversity, again, is the diversity in genes, species, ecosystems, and ecosystem services or processes that enable life processes to happen and be resilient. So on the flip side, if we lose biodiversity, right, we lose species, we lose genetic diversity, we lose ecosystem diversity, we're going to lose ecosystem processes, and that system is going to be more fragile, right? It's not going to take as much of a disturbance to set it into a a recession from which it can't recover, at least hypothetically. So the next part of that would be environmental stewardship. Environmental stewardship is the concept of stewarding the environment. So here's a scholarly definition from a environmental science publication back in 2010. It says that the environmental stewardship is the responsible use and protection of the natural environment through conservation and sustainable practices to enhance ecosystem resilience and human well-being, right? So that's kind of a big picture definition. That in itself is not a uniquely Christian perspective. It's just this view on the environment and environmental issues that humans have a responsibility to use and protect natural uh, resources in a way that enhances resiliency. So thinking protecting biodiversity, keeping the system intact, and promotes human well-being. So it holds those things in tension. So that's the kind of the idea of environmental stewardship, is using the environment well for humans, but in a way that is sustainable and resilient. I want you to think through that from a biblical perspective too, because I think it's compelling, right? I think a biblical worldview really latches on to this idea of environmental stewardship well. As humans, we are, number one, uniquely made in God's image. We talked about that, imago Dei. So as sort of being the pinnacle of God's creation, right? We have a unique responsibility. We talked about that in the first review. We are different than other animals, other created beings, because we uniquely bear God's image, meaning we have a unique relationship with God. We have a soul. We are accountable for our sin, right? We can sin against God. We have to be reconciled to God. So there's a lot wrapped up in that idea, but one that comes to bear here is stewardship. This idea that we are God's image bearers. So we are like him, right? In the sense that we reflect his character. We are creative. We are able to create dominion over the earth. And he even gave us the charge to do it. So that the second thing is that, or the third thing would be that we're made in God's image and given the creation mandate. So looking back at Genesis 1, 26 through 29, the creation account there, Jesus, or excuse me, God, John 1 tells us that Jesus is the creator, but in Colossians 1, but God spoke creation into existence, and then at the end he gave Adam and Eve the responsibility to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it, right? And he gives specific charges, all the things in the ocean, all the things on the earth, that creep on the earth, you have dominion over them. The implication there, especially if we connect it with the rest of the biblical narrative, is that we were meant to enjoy it. We were meant to use it well, to cultivate it, to create civilization, to create cultures, to create this city in the garden. Of course, sin messed it up, but it's still the picture, right, of redemptive history, and our relationship with the earth is one of stewardship, right? We are meant to be reconciled to God, but while we're here on this earth, we're meant to use this earth for human flourishing in a way that honors God, uses it well. So another part of that, I skipped over this second one here, but would be that Scripture talks a lot about the glory of God, particularly demonstrated in his creation, right? So his creative power, his wisdom, his goodness, his sovereign rule over his creation. All those things are meant to compel us to adore and worship him. So I got some of these quotes here from articles. If you want to read more about either of those, this Chapin et al. Article, you can find it by copying this link in your URL. This one by Beisner et al. This is from the Acton group, but this is a collaborative effort by several authors from different Christian or different Judeo-Christian backgrounds, but where they've kind of talked about how the biblical narrative creates this framework for environmental stewardship. Okay, one of the last things you'll be asked to do on that second scenario is to get a pulse on what's going on. So now that you've measured or that you've defined biodiversity, I want you to do a little bit of homework to think about how you would measure biodiversity. So there's a lot of different methods, a lot of different resource methods, but the idea is that you would sample biodiversity. So you have to have some way of monitoring species richness, genetic diversity, ecosystem services, right? And then a way to monitor that. So take a sample. There's a lot of different technology. You can use drones, you can use quadrats. So think about it, do some homework there, but that's the idea, is that you want to think about how you might monitor the biodiversity in this particular ecosystem. And then in the scenario, there'll be some particular types of habitat destruction, loss of biodiversity, and I want you to be able to speak to that, point out which ones humans are contributing to as best you can tell, and then propose strategies for mitigating the impacts of that. So this is an acronym used in environmental science a lot to summarize the impacts of human activity on biodiversity, on the extinction of species, and it's HIPCO. So each of those, HIPPCO, stands for kind of one stream of human activity that can negatively impact biodiversity. So number one is habitat loss. So think about, using land for other purposes, clearing forests, damming up lakes or damming up waters to create lakes, right? Anytime we do that and we create a change in the habitat, that's going to affect the organisms and the ecosystems that depend on that. So habitat loss is a big one. Number two, invasive species. So whether that's just through international trade or through intentional relocation of plants and animals, we can take organisms that live and thrive in a different part of the world, introduce them to one where they don't currently exist, and then they become invasive. They're non-native and they become invasive, meaning they lack natural predators. They thrive in their environment, and that can displace native species and again create disruption to the natural biodiversity and ecosystem services that occur there. Number three, population growth. So just as a direct result of human population, right? Which again, from a biblical review, is a good thing. We want the human population to grow and thrive, but as the human population grows and thrives, it puts more of a strain on the environment, kind of perpetuating all these other ones, right? They're just the strain of sheer population growth puts a harder demand on the environment, which can impact biodiversity. Number four, pollution, right? So as we consume goods, steward the earth, use habitat, our population grows, we create waste products, right? And some of those waste products, depending on how they interact with the environment, have a pollution effect, simply meaning they can be toxic or they can be disruptive to the natural flow of nutrients, even if they're not directly toxic, right? If we put too much, fertilizer runoff, for example, into the water, that's a bad thing, right? It can create too much growth, which can eventually kill the whole system, as we see in lakes, create these dead zones. So pollution. Number five, climate change. There's some debate in this one, but there's much data suggests that the climate changes over time, and as best we can tell, there's been a steady rise in temperatures, a disruption in climate stability over the past 100 years, and it seems to be, at least in part, a result of human activity, right? As population growth happens, as all these other habitat disturbances happen, as greenhouse gas emissions from a variety of activities accumulate, there seems to be a disruption, a measurable disruption that's happening. So climate change is a big one too, at least to the extent that human activity exacerbates it. And then sixth, over exploitation. So this would be over harvesting, right? So just harvesting natural resources in a rate that nature can't keep up with it. Some natural resources are renewable, some are not, right? And so when we overuse those, whether they're renewable or not, again, that can create loss of biodiversity and strain on the environment. So then think about some interventions. Again, do some of your own homework there, but you can think about, for each of these particular ones, maybe think of some ways that we can mitigate it. For habitat destruction, maybe we create better building plans. We designate areas that are sanctuaries, or that are state parks, or that are nature preserves where we don't build, right, to kind of preserve some of that natural biodiversity. For invasive species, right, maybe we choose not to buy non-native plants when we're gardening, and when we're creating the the landscape of a city we're building. Instead, we use native species. For population growth, maybe we find ways to build cities smarter. And as human population grows, particularly in dense areas, we find ways to build strategically so that that puts less strain on the environment. For pollution, right? Maybe we find ways to tax pollution, to find more creative ways to manage waste so that it doesn't directly go in the environment. Climate change, we do better at tracking the data, figure out which inputs of human activity or outputs of human activity can be tracked to climate change, and then monitoring that and trying to take measures to slow down the change in climate from activity. Overexploitation, right? Finding ways to create wildlife areas where hunting can happen, but putting limits on hunting. How many fish can be caught? How many deer can be shot? Putting limits on forestry, right? Maybe using different forestry practices that are more selective. So again, a lot of ways. Those are just some kind of spitball examples. So do some homework, think about those, and you'll be ready for the test. All right, guys, that's it. Hope this was helpful. Good luck on test 3. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Talk to you later.